Johnny Carson was shaking hands with his guest when the man leaned in and whispered something that made Johnny freeze mid-smile. The cameras were already cutting away, but what Johnny did in the next 30 seconds would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was September 12, 1974, and The Tonight Show was running like clockwork. Johnny had just wrapped up an 18-minute interview with David Miller, a high school English teacher from Philadelphia who had written a book about finding joy in ordinary moments. The conversation had been light, funny, and exactly the kind of feel-good segment that audiences loved before heading to bed. Ed McMahon was already reading the next segment's introduction. The studio audience was applauding. The cameras were panning away to capture the audience reaction. Everything was going according to plan. Then, David Miller leaned in close to Johnny's ear and whispered 6 words that would change everything. "Johnny, I'm dying. This was my wish." Johnny's smile didn't just fade, it shattered. His hand, still clasping David's, tightened involuntarily. For a man who had spent a decade perfecting the art of never showing real emotion on camera, Johnny Carson's face betrayed him completely. The thing is, David Miller had been hiding the truth throughout their entire conversation. He was 41 years old, married with 3 children, and had been diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer 4 months earlier. His doctors had given him 6 weeks to live, and that deadline had already passed 2 weeks ago. David had applied to be on The Tonight Show 6 months before his diagnosis. His book, Tuesday Morning Philosophy, was a collection of essays about appreciating small moments, watching rain on windows, drinking coffee before sunrise, listening to his students' laughter. The essays were simple, almost embarrassingly earnest in their optimism. One chapter was literally titled "The Beauty of Tuesday Mornings," and argued that Tuesdays, being the most overlooked day of the week, were actually perfect for noticing life's quiet gifts. It was a modest book from a small press that had sold maybe 3,000 copies, mostly to David's former students and their parents. David had never expected it to get him on national television. But someone at The Tonight Show's booking department had read it during a slow week and thought, "This is exactly the kind of wholesome content Johnny needs between the comedians and the movie stars." When his diagnosis came, David had almost canceled his Tonight Show appearance. The booking was still 3 months away, and his doctors were already talking about aggressive treatments that would leave him too sick to travel. But his wife, Susan, had convinced him otherwise. "You've dreamed about this since you were a kid," she'd said. "We're not letting cancer take this from you, too." She'd contacted the producers herself, moved the booking up, and arranged everything while David was too weak to argue. So David Miller had sat in the green room that September evening, hooked up to a portable pain medication pump hidden under his jacket, and prepared to spend 18 minutes pretending everything was fine. And he'd done it perfectly. He'd been funny, charming, and animated. He'd told stories about his students, made Johnny laugh 3 times, and promoted his book without seeming desperate. To everyone watching, both in the studio and at home, David Miller was just another author having his moment in the spotlight. But when the interview ended and the cameras cut away, David made a split-second decision. He couldn't let this moment pass without telling Johnny the truth. Not because he wanted sympathy, but because Johnny Carson had given him something precious in those 18 minutes. He'd made David feel normal again, made him feel like more than a dying man. The whisper lasted maybe 3 seconds, but to Johnny, it felt like time stopped completely. Johnny's head snapped back to look at David. The applause was still going. Ed was still talking. The cameras had moved on. But Johnny Carson was no longer the host of The Tonight Show. He was just a man staring at another man who had just revealed an unbearable truth. "What?" Johnny said, but the word was lost in the noise of the studio. David smiled. Not a sad smile, but a genuinely grateful one. "Thank you for tonight," he said, his voice barely audible over the applause. "You gave me exactly what I needed." What happened next violated every rule of live television, every protocol, every carefully maintained boundary between host and guest. Johnny Carson pulled David Miller into a tight embrace right there on the stage. His hand went to the back of David's head, and he held him there for several seconds while the applause continued and the show moved forward around them. When they separated, Johnny's eyes were visibly wet. He gripped David's shoulders and said something that the microphones didn't catch. David nodded, wiped his own eyes, and finally walked off stage toward his wife, who was waiting in the wings. The studio audience didn't know what had happened. From their perspective, Johnny had just given an especially warm goodbye to a particularly likable guest. But Susan Miller knew. The moment she saw her husband's face, she knew he'd told Johnny the truth. The show continued. Johnny did his next segment, a comedy bit with a trained seal, but anyone watching closely could see something was off. His timing was slightly slow. His smile was a fraction less bright. He kept glancing toward the side of the stage where David had exited. When the show ended at 1 a.m., Johnny didn't do what he normally did. Instead of heading to his dressing room to unwind with his writers, he told his assistant to find David Miller. "I don't care if he's already left the building," Johnny said. "Find him." David and Susan hadn't left. They were in the parking lot, sitting in their rental car, both crying. They'd planned to drive straight back to their hotel, but neither of them could quite process what had just happened. David had done it. He'd been on The Tonight Show. He'd made Johnny Carson laugh, and somehow, impossibly, he'd also told Johnny the truth. When the NBC security guard knocked on their car window and said, "Mr. Carson would like to see you in his dressing room," they assumed there had been some mistake. There hadn't been. Johnny Carson was waiting in his dressing room, still in his suit, with 2 glasses of scotch poured. When David and Susan walked in, Johnny stood up immediately. "I need you to tell me everything," Johnny said. "No cameras, no audience, no show. Just tell me the truth." For the next hour and 40 minutes, the 3 of them sat in Johnny Carson's dressing room while David told his story. He talked about the diagnosis, the failed treatments, the decision to stop fighting and start appreciating. He talked about his 3 kids, ages 12, 9, and 6, and how he was trying to leave them with enough good memories to last a lifetime. He talked about his book and how ironic it was that he'd spent years writing about appreciating life's small moments, never knowing how literal that advice would become. Johnny barely spoke. He just listened, occasionally refilling drinks, occasionally wiping his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Susan later said that watching Johnny Carson, America's king of cool, the man who never showed emotion, openly cry while listening to her husband's story was one of the most surreal experiences of her life. When David finished talking, Johnny asked one question: "What can I do?" David shook his head. "You already did it. You gave me tonight. You let me be normal for 18 minutes. But Johnny Carson wasn't satisfied with that answer. Over the next 3 weeks, something remarkable happened. Johnny Carson, who famously never socialized with guests outside of the show, called David Miller 6 times. Not through assistants, not through managers. Johnny Carson personally picked up the phone and called a dying English teacher in Philadelphia. They didn't talk about cancer or death. They talked about books, about teaching, about comedy, about life. Johnny told David stories about his own childhood in Nebraska, about failed marriages, about the loneliness of fame. He talked about how he'd built walls around himself over the years, how he'd learned to be charming without ever being real, and how exhausting that performance had become. David told Johnny about his students, about the weird beauty of Philadelphia in autumn, about what it felt like to know exactly when your life would end. He described how time had become elastic. Some hours felt endless, others vanished before he could grab onto them. He talked about watching his children grow up and fast forward, cramming years of fatherhood into weeks. In one conversation, David told Johnny about a lesson he'd taught his students the week after his diagnosis. "I asked them to write down 5 things they did yesterday without thinking about them," David said. "Then I asked them to write down 5 things they wished they'd paid more attention to. Every single kid wrote different answers for both questions. That's when I realized we're all missing different things. There's no one right way to pay attention to life." Johnny was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been on television for a decade, and I don't remember what I said last Tuesday. I don't remember what I wore or who I talked to or if anything mattered. Is that missing it?" "Only if you think so," David replied. "Some people live 80 years without ever wondering if they're missing it. You're asking the question. That counts for something." On October 3rd, 1974, Johnny did something unprecedented. He mentioned David's book on The Tonight Show without David being there. He held up Tuesday Morning Philosophy and told his audience, "A few weeks ago, I had a guest on this show who reminded me why we do this. His book is about paying attention to life while you're living it. I think we could all use that reminder." The book sold 47,000 copies in the next 2 weeks. David Miller lived for 7 more weeks after his Tonight Show appearance. He died on October 31, 1974, at home, surrounded by his family. Susan later said that those final 7 weeks were different from the previous months of illness. David had stopped feeling like a victim and started feeling like himself again. 3 days after David's death, Susan received a delivery. It was a framed photograph of Johnny and David from that night on The Tonight Show, the moment right before David whispered the truth. In the photo, both men were smiling, completely unaware of what was about to happen. There was a handwritten note from Johnny. "He gave me more than I gave him. Thank you for sharing him with me, JC." But the story doesn't end there. In 1975, Susan Miller received another call from The Tonight Show. Johnny wanted to do something, and he needed her permission. He wanted to establish a scholarship fund in David's name for aspiring English teachers. Johnny would personally fund it, but he wanted to announce it on the show. Susan agreed. On February 14, 1975, Johnny Carson announced the David Miller Teaching Scholarship on The Tonight Show. He told a version of David's story, leaving out the personal details but capturing the essence of who David was. Johnny explained that the scholarship would send one English teacher to graduate school every year, fully funded, because David Miller believed that teachers change lives, and he was right. The audience gave a standing ovation. Johnny had to pause for almost a minute to compose himself before continuing with the show. That scholarship still exists today. As of 2024, it has sent 49 English teachers to graduate school. Many have become professors, authors, and educational leaders. None of them ever met David Miller, but all carry forward his belief that small moments matter. Johnny Carson never publicly spoke in detail about his friendship with David Miller. In interviews, when asked about meaningful guests, he would occasionally mention a teacher from Philadelphia, but never elaborated. But people who worked on The Tonight Show during that era remember September 12, 1974, as the night Johnny Carson changed. He became more present during interviews, more willing to let genuine emotion show, more interested in his guests as people rather than performers. After David Miller, one producer recalled years later, Johnny started asking guests real questions. He'd always been good at his job, but after that night, he started caring about it differently. The most telling evidence of David's impact came from Johnny himself, though he never explicitly connected it to David. In his final episode of The Tonight Show in 1992, Johnny closed with this thought: "I've been doing this for 30 years, and I've learned that the best moments were never the planned ones. They were the moments when someone trusted me enough to be real." He paused, and those who knew the story swear they saw him glance toward the spot where David Miller had sat 18 years earlier. "Those moments," Johnny continued, "reminded me that we're all just trying to make our brief time here mean something. And if I helped anyone feel a little less alone, even for 18 minutes, then I did my job." David Miller came on The Tonight Show to promote a book about appreciating ordinary moments. What he didn't know was that he would give Johnny Carson, and through him, millions of viewers, a real lesson in what that actually means. It's not about the grand gestures or the dramatic moments. It's about showing up fully, even when you're dying. It's about being honest, even when it breaks the rules. It's about 18 minutes of conversation that turned into an hour and 40 minutes of truth. It's about a phone call when you didn't have to make one. It's about funding a scholarship for people you'll never meet because someone you barely knew reminded you what matters. Johnny Carson was famous for never letting his guard down. David Miller was dying and pretended to be fine for 18 minutes. When they both stopped pretending, something beautiful happened. If this story of unexpected connection and the power of honest moments moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that small acts of genuine humanity can echo for decades. Have you ever had a brief encounter that changed how you see life? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video for more untold stories about the real people behind entertainment's biggest legends.